Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and in the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, Tell Me a Story, Exploring Narrative Lifestyle. I'm Bradley. I'll be the moderator for this panel, and I'm here with four amazing panelists, Lara Lillibridge, Tim McLaughlin, Chyina Powell, and Mylonas. Hi, everyone.
Nice being here.
So first, I will give each panelist a moment to present themselves, starting with Lara.
So hi, my name is Lara Lillibridge, and I am the author of The Truth About Unringing Phones, which is an essay collection, creative nonfiction. I've also written two memoirs, Mama, Mama, Only Mama, an irreverent guide for the single parent, and Girlish, Growing Up in a Lesbian Home. I have also published a middle grade fantasy novel and an early reader for children. Thanks.
Thank you. Ivan?
Hi, I'm Evan. I'm a speculative fiction writer. I'm the writer of the Clive novel, The Hash, and I also have a number of short stories published in Clarkesworld, Spec, and Fusion Fragment. Currently, I'm working on a couple of novels and editing a short story anthology.
Thank you. Chyina?
Hi, I'm Chyina Powell. I am mainly a editor, but I'm also a multi-genre writer. I tend to write speculative fiction that's very dark, but I also write creative nonfiction and poetry. I'm also the founder of a nonprofit for women of color writers. We offer a safe space and community as well as resources to help them get published as well, called the Women of Colors Writer Circle.
All right. And Tim?
Hello, my name is Tim McLaughlin. I write the paranormal and urban fantasy series Tall Tales, 2 volumes of which are out. I'm working on the 3rd right now. I also have a middle grade fairy tale that will be published by the time this airs, but it's not out yet. That's being written under a pen name, so it avoids confusion with this series, which is not for children. I also run a tabletop gaming group that raises money for Children's Miracle Network hospitals and streams on Twitch, and you can find all that information at temclaughlin.weebly.com.
All right, so let's start with the question. First of all, why explore different narrative style? Evan?
Frankly speaking, from my side, I tend to get a little bored with traditional narrative styles, and it's not a matter of just wanting something different, but well, as far as I'm concerned, writing has so much to offer in terms of how you present it. So I really see no reason why anybody should be sticking to the same old. Writing a straightforward story or something, as a matter of fact, doesn't really excite me anymore. I've been trying to push towards more alternative narrative styles in my own stories and the upcoming novels that I'm working on. And some of it has also been it's been a bit of a matter of necessity as well, because as life becomes more complicated, it becomes a little bit more hectic. You're also finding yourself adapting to a style that works for you. On my side, I'm tending towards a bit of a more choppy, more disjointed style, which I think it works well for getting writing in between breaks whenever you can. But having said that, alternative narrative styles haven't been anything new. There have been different narrative styles with visual components to them, which immediately grab the reader, and they immediately become a thing of a factor that makes you stand out. And if something makes your story stand out, immediately your story will become a little bit more noticeable, will become more memorable as well. I remember early on in my writing career, I was talking to an editor who started basking me over the head for not using quotation marks, saying you have to use quotation marks when it comes to dialogue. And I made a promise to myself to forever be mentioning her as a very bad example of an editor, because nobody should be telling you how you should be writing. Everybody should be giving you advice on how to get your message across. And if that needs an alternative narrative style, so be it, whatever serves the story.
All right. Chyina?
I completely agree. It helps, break up the monotony. If you're writing in the same narrative style all the time, sometimes it can be a bit boring, it can draw on, and you start to lose your passion for writing a bit. But I also think that as writers, in order to grow as writers, we have to experiment. It's a great way to find out what methods work best for you, because every writer's different. Some writers tend to write very long, ornate, flowy work. Some writers, use fragments and it gets the point across, in the very same way. It also gives you an appreciation for styles you may not work with very often. If you have never written a novel in verse, you will learn. If you try even writing a short story in verse, you will have a huge appreciation for writers who can do that after you try it. And like I said, it breaks up the monotony. It's a good way also, I find, if you're in a rut, if some people call it writer's block, whatever you may call it, it's a great way to free write. And push you through that aspect of your story, your narrative that you may be having trouble with. Even if you never actually use it in your work, it's a good way to come up with new ideas and generate creativity.
All right. Tim?
Yeah, I take an approach to things where I really like to explore what a thing is capable of. And so, like, when I was doing a webcomic, I experimented a lot with what having a visual medium on the internet with an infinite canvas really can do. And when I'm writing, I really like to explore what types of things can I do that will, kind of explore what writing is capable of. Like, as a medium, there are things that you can do there that you might not be able to do otherwise. And exploring different narrative styles really opens up various avenues to that, where you're finding new ways that you can get people to kind of explore the written medium and follow this story, and do that in a new and interesting way that just kind of adds complexity to the experience and adds a bit more appreciation and a bit more depth to what the writing medium itself is. And so for that, it's very appealing to me to kind of explore these different styles and borrow things from existing styles.
All right. Lara?
These are all such great answers. I think for me, when I find the right style, it really unlocks something new for me in the writing. For example, this book is told in fragments, and my father lived 4,000 miles away, so my interactions with him were fragments. So trying to write a traditional narrative just didn't work, because what I had were these flashes of memory, not really a continuous story. I also think that playing with form allows us to include nuance and side characters or alternate points of view that can be a lot harder to put into a traditional narrative.
All right. Next question. How do you know if a new style is effective? Chyina?
Oh, this is a tough question for me, because effective for me can mean something completely different for the next writer. Effective for me does not mean that it shows up in my finished work. It just means that I gain a new perspective. So if I'm writing and I'm having trouble with a story, or I feel like the style I'm writing in doesn't quite work, and I decide to try a new style, it becomes effective for me if I decide that even if I don't use it in the current work, if I like that style, if it works, if it generates new ideas, if it's fun to write in, if it feels more natural, But I also know that for a lot of writers, a style is effective once you can use it in the current work. But for me, as long as I'm growing from it, as long as I'm learning and growing as a writer, it's effective.
All right. Tim?
Yeah, I use a definition for effectiveness in writing where the question is about the reader experience. Is this conveying to a reader the atmosphere and the information that I want them to be experiencing? Are they getting the story that I'm trying to get? Are they getting the atmosphere that I want them to get from it? Are the beats working to drive them at the pace that I want them to be at? And so that's very much how I'm going to define that, and how I'm going to decide whether or not a style is effective is by reading through it and maybe having other people read through it and just kind of, how does this move? How does it feel? How do you engage with it? Does it convey what I want it to convey?
All right. Evan?
Well, Lara and Tim both touched upon it, which is effective for what reason? What are you trying to achieve, right? There is something to be said about personal satisfaction and stretching your creative muscles, but in the end of the day, you are trying to tell a story. And if a story is better being served by approaching it in a specific way, that is effective. An example would be there is a scene in The Hush, my novel, where somebody's hearing somebody screaming from a distance. So there is no description. It's literally just fragments of speech. And the reasoning behind this, I hope it's effective, but the reasoning behind this is that you have no idea what's happening. You only get bits and pieces. You get fragmented information. And to Lara's point, she had this very fragmented communication, and that perfectly lended itself to a more choppy narrative, more choppy approach. So I would always ask, I would ask two questions. One of them, does the style serve the story? That's one thing. And the other thing is, and this is related, does it actually feel gimmicky? If it feels gimmicky, it's probably because it's gratuitous and you don't actually need it. So in any case where I'm asking myself, is this style effective? I'll probably be asking myself these two things. Does it do what I want it to do? And could I do without it? Because if I could do without it, then it's probably not needed. It's probably not effective.
All right. And Lara?
That's funny when you say gimmicky, because that's something that sometimes I worry about with my own writing, right? Because I do love these alternative styles so much, and I worry they become tiresome. But for me, I know that it's right when I get to the end of the book and I say, or the end of the manuscript, and say, yes, that's exactly how I want to tell it. That's the best way. That's the best representation of the characters, whether they be true or whether they be real life characters or fictional. But then I always have a couple of trusted beta readers that who are known very well to me, who will say, yeah, that is gimmicky, or yeah, that's really a stretch, or will say, have you tried this idea or that? And I do like what Chyina said about, writing in different forms, not necessarily for the work in progress, but for your growth as a writer, and to deepen, for me at least, my understanding of the characters. Sometimes writing in different styles can help me with character development, and can help me see things, even in nonfiction, from a family member's point of view instead of just my own. And even if that doesn't come into the final draft, it does serve the work and make it deeper.
You're doing creative nonfiction, right? So that's an absolute favorite of mine, just because of how easy it is to introduce different styles in there. It just makes my whole day when I open a nonfiction story and I can see a lot of creativity in there.
Yeah. All right. So next, what are the different ways to alternate the narrative style in a story? Starting with Lara.
So I think, and everyone has sort of touched on this, that, alternative styles can be really exciting. And I feel like there really aren't rules. And when you throw them out, you can really come up with something really dynamic. So when you say the different ways you can combine, I've combined different points of view between first person and third person and second person. I love second person, even though I feel like most people don't. I do a lot of varied length between very short chapters that are only a few sentences and then longer chapters that are, 5 or 10 pages. I have done differences in style in terms of narrative essays combined with something more experimental like a crossword puzzle or a quiz. I think that really anything that you can think of, you can make work if you have the craft behind it. But also, you're probably not the only one who's thought of it, which is funny. There's been times I've thought, oh, I have this wonderful idea, just to find out that 5 other people have already published something using my wonderful idea before I even thought of it.
All right. Chyina?
Just to say, I also love second person. It's so much fun to write in and read when it's done correctly. I think that some of the most common ways are, multiple POV. But I think some of the ways that I enjoy most are non-linear storytelling. Something I've used in my creative nonfiction is combining poetry, photography, which is nice, having that image and poetry superimposed on the image is really fun. To Laura's point, there's so many ways to do it. I've seen stories told through like newspaper clippings, stories told through text messages back and forth, emails. It really depends on what the genre of your story as well as the story that you're trying to tell. But there are so many different ways to alternate. We could talk about that itself for an hour or two.
All right. Tim?
So Tall Tales is a collection of short stories, most of which are told from this handful of characters' perspectives. And so one of the ways that that is done in those books is just by multiple point of view, like Chyina was talking about, where, Madison will talk in a specific way. This is who he is and how he approaches the thing. And these are the things he's going to notice. And so some of that goes on, whereas one of the stories is documents that are part of a trial that's happening. And so it's just this loose collection of documents, and some of them are like news articles, and some of them are journal entries, and some of them are, observations from someone else or whatever. And so that I find is the easiest way to explore different narrative styles, is just, how does this person want to tell the story? How does this document fit into this? How does, where did they go to get this information, and then cite that. But there are, I think another way to do it that I haven't explored as much is to kind of follow the emotional journey of a single character. Like if you're doing it all in the same first person, at different, allowing their emotions to come through in different styles. Like when they're frantic, it feels more frantic, when you use a legitimately different style to do that. And so, yeah, I think that it really, most of the ways that it's going to feel natural is if it comes from the story itself, is if this narrative style fits what's being said or what information is being conveyed. I think that you can play with that a lot and have it work pretty well.
All right. And Evan?
I think everybody has pretty much touched upon the main principle, which is that there are no principles, and you should question every single piece of conventional wisdom, all of it. Like as they say, know the rules, but also know when to break them. But beyond that, there's also a big there's also something to be said about cross-pollination with other media. I mean, this is how we get epistolary fiction, for example. As a matter of fact, when Chyina was talking, it reminded me of a book called Illuminate. I don't know if anybody else has read it. It's a great book, and it's written in a variety of formats, such as emails, medical reports, scraps of notes, transcripts. It's a great book. And it's nothing new. So there is something very freeing about knowing that your great idea is not precious. It has been done several times before, probably. So there is no point agonizing about it. You're not going to be breaking any new ground. And there is something very liberating about this. I'd say it all depends what you're trying to achieve, being open-minded about the possibilities. If you have a great idea and it sounds crazy, then it's probably a great, crazy idea. You should definitely try it, just for the sake of it. And the other thing is reading widely and also reading literature from other cultures, because that helps with expanding your vocabulary of what is possible. There is something to be said about the way that Western literature looks like right now, but there are lots of alternative narrative styles that come from other great literary traditions, such as Chinese literature, or such as the Australian Aboriginal tradition. And why not dive into them and pick bits and pieces and just expand your horizon? Other than the fact that you're probably going to come across some great stories, it's a win in my book. You're just expanding your own vocabulary of what is possible out there.
Yeah. Next, what are the best example of alternative narrative style? Starting with Tim.
I think Evan started touching on this a bit when he talked about different cultural styles. And because, I'm in the United States, most stories here are told in a very Western style. And the more you allow kind of existing styles from outside of your own culture to get a foothold, like the way that Aboriginal people in Australia will tell stories, or the way that, in Central America, where the what's it called? Magical realism really rose from. Kind of, all of these things have their own narrative styles that are going to be a vast departure from kind of whatever your culture, you're coming from. There's going to be somewhere out there is a culture that tells a story in a different way. And so I think that the best examples that come to mind are just things like that, where it's like, go read some magical realism and see how different it is from fantasy, and how different it is from, kind of some of this high fantasy or urban fantasy or type of stories that exist, how it utilizes the setting in a different way, how it tells the story in a different way. And I'm drawing a blank on any specific stories off the top of my head because I haven't read any in a while. But, just I think that that's going to be the easiest place to go to start to see really good examples of different narrative styles, is just look outside of the culture that you're in right now.
All right. Lara?
That's interesting. And I agree. And I also, one thing Tim said, reading outside of your genre, I think can be incredibly helpful. Just in terms of reading like a writer and paying attention to how the book is put together and what is effective about it, and really sort of taking it apart. Two books that I love. One is actually really old. It's from the 70s, which I didn't realize until I Googled it for this, but it's called If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino. I probably butchered his name. And it's this really amazing book about someone who finds a book that is published incorrectly. So there's like the beginning of one story, and just when you get into it, it ends and you turn the page and it's a different story. and there's a lot of second person in it. And really, that book showed me, really how to hook a reader and how to bring someone in, because I could see in just, a few paragraphs, I was totally invested in this new story, and it was almost painful when it would go to a different one. But again, with what people are saying about reading, outside of your traditional narrative, that's not a book that was originally written in English, which I didn't even think about until this panel. Another book in terms of creative nonfiction is called My Body is a Book of Rules by Alyssa Washutta. And that is one of my favorite books to teach, because she has these beautiful lyrical essays, and then she has fake letters or revised letters from doctors, and she has a script for a Law and Order SVU dialogue with her own personal experiences, in there for the answers. And because she sticks very tightly to theme, she's able to use all of these really disparate styles and have it really work well. I really admire both of those books personally.
Thanks. Ivan?
Oh, I really, really like Italo Calvino. Actually, his other big book, Invisible Cities, is probably one of my favorite books of all time. And that's a book where Marco Polo tells stories to Genghis Khan, and every single page is a different story. Every single story is about a city, but the Khan knows that Marco Polo is lying out of his behind. And that is part of the narrative, that he knows that Marco Polo is lying, and just the fragmented nature kind of makes you get all lost in these fairy tale descriptions. Well, I'm based in Europe, so there's Italy has a very big tradition of messing around with narrative styles. Tim mentioned it, Latin American magic realism. I recently read a book called The People of Paper by Salvador Plasencia that does have a number of sections and a number of narrators, one of which is psychic and actively stops the reader from reading his thoughts. And the way that this appears on page is that there's literally a big black blank over the text. You just cannot tell what the character is thinking. There is this other book by Julio Cortázar called Hopscotch, which is a novel written in a create your own adventure style. And you can start reading this book in any way, and you will get eventually your own adventure. But going a little bit more, just to be fair to Western literature, there's also the Canterbury Tales from the 1600s, great book, and there's also probably the biggest alternative narrative book in the in Western literature, which is House of Leaves, and anything that Danilevsky has ever written. And I urge everybody to read that book. I don't get scared by reading books, but that book gave me the creeps. It's a story within a story within a story, most of it being told through footnotes. And sometimes the footnotes just completely take over the book. So there's just so much out there. The Portuguese have a great school of literature as well, where they're playing a little bit with the narrative styles. But if you look for it, you'll find it. There is plenty and plenty of titles out there, and this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as I'm concerned.
All right, Chyina?
Well, both Laura and Evan took two of my examples, but I, won't fault them for that. Those are some amazing books. When I first saw this question, one book that came to mind was Margaret Atwood's Blind Assassins, which is told through newspaper clippings. There's an in-story book, and there's a lot of other cool features, which I think is fun. I love stories within stories. And another that has not been brought up is Suni Dean's The Book Eaters, in which it's the same person, it's the same main character, but each chapter alternates timelines. So you kind of see the growth of that character from chapter to chapter, but you don't really know what's happening because you have no idea what's happened between those two timelines. and I think that's fun. Another one that comes to mind is The Martian, which a lot of people have, read, which is told mainly in the form of a logbook. There's good old epistolaries like This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is told between the two main characters. I think that while I would push against the best examples, it really depends on what story you're trying to tell. Second person works really well for thriller and horror situations, but it may not work well in other situations. There are tons of novels in verse that are coming to mind, but I think, like I said, I think that the My Body book is probably one of my favorite books. My Body is a Book of Rules, and I think that's a great example of how you can fit multiple alternative narrative styles in one book, and it makes perfect sense. It works so well with what the author is doing, and sometimes that's hard. So being able to see multiple styles and it's not a very long book either. So within such a short, span of pages, actually, in my opinion, can help you grow as a writer. You can see what's been done, and you can, kind of gives you that confidence, like I can do this too.
Yeah. Personally, one example I read a while back was a book called Mr. Beacon, which is basically the idea is like it's a demon trapped into a book, and is telling the reader to actually burn the book. But while burning, the demon tells his own story with a reliable narrator style. And he tells his story. His story was still bargaining with the reader to like burn his book. That's an idea that I like as well. What are some key things to consider when choosing a narrative style? Starting with Chyina.
I think the most important thing, and we've kind of touched on it before, is the story you're trying to tell. Think of who your audience is. As I mentioned, certain genres work best in certain narrative styles. And sometimes, your audience may have expectations of you as a writer. And sometimes more unconventional styles work better in certain genres. So let's say you are writing a cozy mystery that involves clues and recipes, and so maybe having recipes, dispersed throughout your book may work, but that's not going to work the same way. It's not going to have the same impact if you're writing like a high stakes, action-packed thriller, because it doesn't fit the genre, and it doesn't fit the story you're telling. So I think that's the biggest thing that comes to mind. And again, expectations of your reader. While you may, you write for yourself first, but you are writing for an audience. So if your audience is expecting one thing, you can play with the expectations, but if they're expecting a happily ever after and you don't give them that, or if they're expecting some sort of payoff for this narrative style that you're using that's kind of different and it doesn't seem to matter to the story, they're going to be disappointed with you, and you may lose readers for that.
All right. Evan?
So usually reminded of the story of how bullet time was created for the Matrix. So that entire technology was based on a scientific paper of all things that basically asked the question, how do we freeze time on film but continue with the plot? So basically disconnect those two dimensions of plot versus time. And that sounds super dry and super academic, and it probably is, but then the execution of it, I think everybody's jaw just dropped when they saw it in the movies. So when I'm thinking about a narrative style that works, I usually try to approach this from a bit of a clinical point of view, and basically ask myself, what is it that I'm trying to do here? Am I trying to, for example, create a sense of disconnect? Am I trying to create a sense of fragmentation? What is the impact that I'm trying to cause? And from there onwards, if I do find a style that might work or find a great idea, then I ask myself, is it cool? Because we're not doing, this is not academic discourse. At the end of the day, we're still writing stories, and stories need to have an emotional, they need to have emotional resonance, and they need to have emotional impact. So it's a case of figuring out your narrative style, figuring out whether or not from a mechanistic point of view it makes sense, but then understanding that you're still trying to tell a story. And on a certain level, stories are always meant to be entertaining. So being able to marry these two, that's usually what I would go for.
All right, Lara?
I have two things that I hate when I read a book. And one is if it bores me. And when I was younger, I would power through, but now my TBR pile is too tall. There's too many good books I want to read. But I feel like we owe our readers a good use of their time. That, you know, they are giving us hours and hours of their life to read, you know, an entire book. And, you know, we owe them a good experience. But on the other hand, I hate to be confused. And I have read books where I have yelled into the room, you know, confusing your reader is not art. And there's really a fine line between going so weird that you lose the reader, or so traditional that you put the reader to sleep. And there's not really a way for me to say how to do that other than to be aware of the two extremes.
All right. And Tim?
Yeah, I think it's mostly been touched on already, but basically it is, you know, what are you trying to convey? What information do you want the reader to have? What experience do you want them to have? And how, you know, how does this narrative style that you're considering serve that purpose? You know, like it's all about, I think basically all the rules come down to what tells the story that you want to tell. And so that's the primary factor in my consideration is, does this do what I want it to do? Does it convey to the readers what I want to convey to them? You know, how does this play into that? And I think that really is the main consideration. But I think there is a secondary consideration that should be brought up, which is just how well can I do that? Like, if you're looking at it and be like, the best way to do this is in, you know, letters between characters. Okay, how well can I write their different voices? And if it is something where you're just like, I'm not ready to do that, you want to either consider an alternative style or take some time, like Chyina was talking about earlier, and practice that style in another way, in another place. Get to that point where you're ready to tell this story the way that you want to tell it. But that question does need to come up, like, am I able to do what I'm trying to do with this style at this point in time, or do I need to come back to it later, or do I need to find an alternative?
All right. Next question. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but what are the things to avoid when considering narrative style? So I think with Ivan.
I think there's only one rule really, and that is never let anybody tell you what you can or can't do. Or at least ask them why. What do you feel like this is not the right way to do it? But this is not a matter of right or wrong, but this is a matter of being more or less appropriate for a specific story. The moment somebody says you cannot do this, automatically their opinion stops mattering, because nobody who has ever listened to rules has ever done anything worth reading. So I would say just question constantly, why am I supposed to be doing this again? Why are the rules the way that they are? And also internalize the fact that there are no rules. There's good practices that work for the most time. for the most, usually the work, but then might not be right for your story. So just question and question and question. And if somebody tells you that you're doing things the wrong way, ask them why. If you get satisfied by the answer, great. If not, just casually push them to the side and keep being awesome, I guess.
All right, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's really sound advice. And another thing I think to avoid is using styles to their weakness. So like if look at the different styles that you're considering, they're going to be stronger in some areas than others. And this has been brought up already. Like sometimes it's going to be, this style is really good at conveying this thing, or this style is really good at, telling this type of story. One thing that I think you want to avoid is taking something that a style is weak at and trying to shoehorn it into that, just because you really want to have the story told through, this medium or this narrative style. If it doesn't really work, if you're really kind of shoehorning it in, don't do that. Like it's gonna be a lot easier. I think you're gonna get a lot better of a product if you either find a style that has that strength, or you find a way to borrow from styles that have that strength to kind of reinforce it. Don't try to force something to do something it's not good at doing.
All right. Lara?
That's funny because Tim took my answer. For me, when something is forced, it's never right. I remember a friend of mine read an essay I wrote, years ago, and she said it's like a Frankenstein essay. It's like half of one thing and half of something else, but they're not going together properly. And it doesn't mean that I didn't give up on the style. I just had to work through it so that it was a little bit more seamless. Because I do agree with Yvonne that, don't tell them, as soon as someone tells me I can't do something, then I'm like, oh, you better watch, because I'm going to do it. And I do agree that is where great art is made. But I get into ruts where the style that I've chosen becomes too repetitive to sustain for a book length work. I had a book, Chyina was saying, with recipes, and I actually wrote a book with recipes, but I had so many recipes that my beta readers were like, look, we don't really care. Like, this is not information that is moving it forward. So I had to look at the arc and actually make an arc that built from the first recipe to the end to show growth, to make them actually serve the purpose of the book, which is what Tim was saying. Does it serve the purpose? Does it drive the story forward, or is it just a cute distraction?
All right. And Chyina?
I totally agree with what's been said already. I think that one thing, as an editor, something that I see my clients do a lot is try to match someone else's style, especially if they're newer writers. If they like a book and they're like, I want to write something similar to this, or if they like a specific narrative style and they're trying to force it, and it doesn't work for the story, or it feels unnatural. It doesn't feel like them, that they're just like Laura mentioned, like a Frankenstein, where it's like pieces and bits work, other places it doesn't. We're all unique individuals, and our story should be like that. Even if we tell a story through a certain narrative style, we should make it our own instead of trying to, mimic someone else. And to Evan's point, I completely agree with, if someone tells you not to do it, go ahead and do it, because they're probably wrong. More like 99.9% of the time they're wrong. But I also think that it's important to have beta readers and critique partners. Especially as creatives, we can have such lofty ideas, but sometimes as we have them, they don't work. And it's better to have those critique partners, those beta readers, earlier on, especially if you're exploring a new narrative style you may not be familiar with, to say, hey, does this work? And get feedback so that you can grow. I've seen writers who try out a new narrative style and then get feedback and they know they can change their, their manuscript, but they don't know how. And, this is after hours and hours, weeks and weeks spent finishing a manuscript, and it feels like a lot of lost and wasted time. So sometimes we do need outside feedback, but that doesn't mean you have to accept everyone's feedback. It's nice to have an extra pair of eyes on the work you're doing.
Right. So there was also a question I had for list today. So I will give each of them one last round to either give a nice advice to our viewers or to plug anything they want to plug. Starting with Tim.
Yeah, so the last piece of advice I would give is, I tell people this a fair bit, is anytime you have someone try to give you a rule, because we've touched on rules a lot, anytime someone tries to give you a rule, it's usually like never do this or never do that or whatever, always do this. I always add to the end of it without reason. And that will clarify a lot of those rules, is never do this unless you have a good reason to. That gives you reason to stop, adding that makes you stop and think, okay, why am I doing this? What do I want to accomplish with this? Why am I breaking this rule? And if it tells you that you should do that, then go ahead and do that. If it tells you that you shouldn't, then you should. And just adding that little phrase without reason to the end of each of those pieces of advice, I think will really guide your process in thinking through how to approach these different styles. Yeah, like I said, Tim McLaughlin, Tall Tales, and the Beaver Prince is the story that will be coming out soon. And you can find all of my projects, my fundraising, and Twitch channels, the games that I'm writing, and the books that currently exist at temclaughlin.com. It's gonna be spelled just like that. temclaughlin.weebly, weebly.com. You'll find all my stuff there and links to anything else that you need to find on a different website.
All right, Chyina?
Last bit of advice, it would be, don't be afraid to try a new narrative style. It's fun and you're going to enjoy it, even if it seems kind of daunting at first. I'm Chyina Powell everywhere. I'm not creative enough to have a pen name. You can find all my books and short stories under Chyina Powell. If you want, a free editing, book or anything like that, or if you want to, meet with me, powelleditorial.org, or if you want to find more about the Writer Circle or any of the nonprofits that I work with, you can just contact me through my website, powelleditorial.org. With the chat, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm still on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky.
All right. Evan?
So the last piece of advice, it's only just words on paper. So go for it. Try different things. Read widely. Read outside your genre. Read different books from different cultures, stories from different cultures, and just keep an open mind and do whatever you want. As far as reaching out to me, I'm trying to avoid the dumpster fire that is social media. Having said that, if you write to me on EA_Mylonas on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, I will answer. And you can also check out my website, which is EA_Mylonas.com.
Right. And Lara?
I think the best piece of advice I ever got was from a writer named Kao Kalia Yang, who writes in multiple genres. And she said, remember, our earlier work is a snapshot of who we were when we wrote it. That means it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to cringe when you look 10 years down the road at what you wrote before. And that for me was very, very freeing. Like when you look at a picture of yourself at 5 years old, you don't say, but she didn't know how to ride a bike. You just admire the cute child you used to be. And be gentle with yourself. As writers, we oftentimes can become such perfectionists that we never get published because we think, oh, it needs one more round. And I'm a believer in don't over polish it. Let it be a little bit raw and have some life. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, Facebook, whatever, as Lara Lillibridge. I have a website, laralillibridge.com, but I haven't updated it in a long time. I am remiss. But I do also want to thank WriteHive and my fellow panelists, because this has been such an amazing conversation. And Brad, thank you for moderating this, because it's been an absolute treat.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for watching this video. If you are interested about this topic, you can also check out on our channel the World McCafe episode 14, types of voices, writer versus narrator versus character. Other than that, if you like the panelists, will be in the chat to answer any of the questions. Other than that, happy rest of your day and happy WriteHive 2024. See you next time.